So we have today three speakers. The first speaker is Professor Odagiri, and then Emma Lavinia will join from Italy through Zoom. And then we change our program. Instead of Marcello Ghilardi, third speaker today will be Tobias Bartnek. So we have three speakers, and I think we can start soon. And the first speaker, Professor Odagiri, has a PDF, and he will share the screen and read the presentation. So let's start. Lavinia is here. I just asked her if she agrees to for recording. Ciao Lavinia, mi senti?
Sento, voi mi sentite?
Sì, benissimo, stiamo registrando, va bene per te se registriamo il workshop?
Sì, sì, certo, assolutamente.
Ok, perfetto, allora cominciamo. So, please.
So it's microphone.
Microphone is here, so you don't care about microphone. You have just to share the screen. But I think you can do it. Possible if you make it bigger.
Yeah. I'll make it bigger.
Your fingers.
No,
No?
I don't think so. The first one.
Window. Okay, perfect. It's okay now? Please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Michele Odagiri from Canada University, and I will probably present for 15 minutes or so, and then we can have Q&A session. Now I will read this. Nishitani's theory of course. This study examined Nishitani's ku to soku, especially its theory of imagination or the power of imagination, Nishitani's theory of imagination, ku to soku, which is presented in a close correlation with two other concepts in the essay, emptiness and equal, is in one respect a reinterpretation of the notion of kousōryoku, which Miki attempts to elaborate in his logical imagination, and is itself based on Miki's creative reading of Kant anthropology. Although Nishitani does not mention Miki explicitly, Nishitani relates kousōryoku to technology, inventions, and myths at the end of the essay, which indicates some influence from Miki's work on imagination. The quotation is from Nishitani Keiji, Takushi, volume 13, page 158. A distinct characteristic of Nishitani's theory is that he discussed imagination to the concept of egotic function. I translated it into reflected relations, possibly there are other translations, and dharmadatsu of non-interference among phenomena. In this presentation, I'd like to mostly postpone this important aspect of his theory of imagination, rather focusing on certain inadequacy of his theory, or more specifically, a potential critique of this theory from Miki's perspective. For Nishitani, 構想力 or the power of imagination is indivisible from one's ability to intuit interreflective relation with other beings. Nishitani mentioned various examples of interreflective images or imagination, including imago Dei in human being, or Buddha nature in all sentient beings, and Basho's poetry. In each of these cases, an image is essentially considered placeful for all existence. Namely, for Nishitani, imagination turns self-existence of something into its placeful in the world, or its substantiality into interreflective relationship. However, Nishitani's theory of imagination is both, I should let you know, right?
Yes. Thank you.
We both answer the practitioner guided. In particular, it's possible from Miki's standpoint, presumably, to regard Nishitani's contemplation as that of theoria rather than praxis or poiesis, even though Nishitani himself would probably reject this critique. This critique related a difference in the respective understandings of technology and history, both of which are essential for construing Miki's notion of imagination. Underlying Miki's notion of imagination is Nishida's idea of action, intuition, qualitative直感, which seems to have little or no impact on Nishitani's 1982 essay. The first section, imagination of theory, imagination of praxis. According to Kant anthropology, imagination, or the power of imagination is a faculty of intuition without presence of the object. This faculty is either productive, being the faculty of the original presentation of the object, or reproductive, being the faculty of derivative presentation of the object. That is, imagination can either precede experiences or bring back to mind an empirical intuition that they had previously. Now, Kant's definition of imagination, I argue, can be extended to two different ways of conceptualization. Imagination, either productive or reproductive, can be a faculty about something not seen, or faculty about something yet to be seen. But differently, imagination thus defined can be conceived as the notion of theoria or that of praxis. If imagination is simply considered a non-perceptive faculty of intuition about something not seen, it is faculty of mental images, either of productive or reproductive kind. Arguably, this conceptualization of imagination can have a certain affinity with mystic thought or mysticism. If, on the contrary, imagination is to be associated with our ongoing interaction with various objects yet to be seen, that is, it is considered an active engagement of mind and body with historical reality, it should no longer be considered a mere faculty of intuition, but that of technological intervention or alteration of the world. In other words, the power of imagination or 構想力 conceived thus involves the mind body of action intuition in the historical world. Now, clearly, Miki seems to be more interested in the latter aspect of imagination, namely its technological aspect. Far from being mystic, he focuses on praxis of imagination, ranging from handicrafts to myths and social institutions. This is where I find a potential critique of Nishitani's theory of imagination in Miki's late thought. As far as I can see in the text of Emptiness and soku, Nishitani does not deal with something yet to be seen. In other words, for Nishitani, imagination or image is not a matter of technological dealings with the world of history. Consider some of the examples Nishitani mentioned in the text. The imago Dei in human being, or Buddha nature in all sentient beings. They are both discussed in the text with respect to either the existence or the non-existence of something in the mind of human being or sentient being. These images are interreflective relations seen from the side of a human being or sentient being. So it is true that they are, in this sense, not presented as purely mental images. But it is still difficult to think of them as correlated with action intuition. Difficult to think of them as correlated with action intuition. Namely, it's difficult to conceive of the technological historical nature. On the contrary, Mickey's notion of imagination is very different. His is closely related to his techno-ontology, philosophy of history, and philosophical anthropology. In particular, Mickey eventually replaced his notion of imagination with the notion of form, katachi, which then becomes a central notion of philosophy of technology in 1942. Nishitani's reading of Basho poetry of chirping cicada is quite unsatisfactory for similar reasons. He only briefly discussed that in a line or two. For Nishitani, the essence of this haiku consists of an affective correlation of Teshikyo Miezu, a view is not seen, and seminal poet, Ricardo chirping. The correlation is not logical or conceptual, but affective, as he puts it. Thus, here again, Nishitani finds in this haiku the interreflective correlation between affective embodiment of the author and the chirping cicada. But in my view, what he does not quite see here is the element of imada miezu, not seen yet. Well, it's not in the text, but it's implied, yet to be seen. The fact that the view is not inside now, although it's clearly anticipated. Nishitani only observes interreflective relation between the affect of human and cicada. He does not see them as an event in the world of history. But differently, Nishitani seems not to think that logical imagination is actually logical form, as Mickey himself puts it in his 1939 preface of Logical Imagination. This is from Miki Kiyoshi Zenshu, Volume 8, page 5 and 6. しかるにやがて制度について考察を始めた頃から私の考える構想物の論理が実は形の論理であるということが断じ明らかになってきた。Skip one sentence. 構想力の論理といういわば主観的な表現は形の論理といういわば客観的な表現を見出すことによって私の思想は今一応の安定に達したのである。かようにして私は私自身のいわば人間的な問題から出発しながら、現在到達した点において西田哲学へ、私の理解する限りにおいて接近してきたのを見る。Read my translation. However, from around the time in which I started thinking about intuition, it has become gradually clear that my idea of logical imagination is actually logical form. What I call logical imagination is a rather subjective expression of my thought, but I have reformulated as logical form, which is the more objective expression. My thought has reached a certain state of maturity and stability by now. This makes me think that while I started from my own human problem, at the present stage I have come close to Nishida philosophy, as far as I understand it. Now, one can read a potential criticism of Nishitani into this passage by Miki, although, of course, Miki did not know the later development of Nishitani's thought, or more specifically, Nishitani's concept of the egotic kanke and his theory of image in ku to soku. For Miki, logical imagination is subjective expression of historical reality and its techno-ontological nature. Thus, one should more objectively conceive of it as logical form. That is, Miki rejects certain cognitism or psychologism inherent in the notion of imagination. I would even argue that he attempts to grasp Gestalt-like quality of imagination, seen as ecological configuration rather than as mental cognitive property of the mind. This is a topic of the previous presentation a year ago. But Nishitani, again, I argue, does not quite see the problem of form as Miki put it here. Although Nishitani emphasized the inter-reflective structure of different minds, such as God, the human being, or Buddha and sentient being, imagination for him is still a faculty of intuition, if not a purely cognitive or mental faculty. It is now necessary to briefly discuss Miki's logical form to clarify this point, the point about technology further. Next section. At the beginning of philosophy of technology, Miki examined Wolfgang Ghilardi's Gestalt learning, specifically the phenomena called insight, Einsicht. Miki says that technology is an innovation of new behavior form, and I have discussed this issue elsewhere, and here I would like to only summarize the main point. In the experiment, a primary subject is observed to be able to make a detour to get the food or to use a stick-like object to reach one. They can even combine two objects to create a single tool useful for that purpose. For Keller himself, these observations show that chimpanzees' learning process do not simply go through trial and error. Rather, their learning is done by insight. The instant learning of these chimpanzees is for Keller an acquisition of a gestalt in their mind, which allows them to grasp task situation from a broader or long-term perspective, or possibly purposive perspective. But Miki interprets these experiments slightly differently as a model for the phylogeny of human technology. Miki writes, what Keller's experiment shows is that technology in its phylogenic archetypes and innovation of a new behavior form as adaptation to a new environment. Gestalt is not simply an eidetic form, but historical materiality for Miki. Technology is thus distinguished from instinctive behaviors. A lead translation. It shows that beehives, spiders' webs looks as if they were product of superb technology. In it, one can find quasi-technological behavior which appears to be far more impeccable than chimpanzees' clumsy act of using sticks or stacking boxes to reach bananas place where they can't reach otherwise. Nevertheless, there is an essential difference between these two cases. It is in this context that Miki first mentioned the term form or innovation in the 1942 text. Spiders' weaving of web is their instinctive behavior and far from versatile for other purposes. But chimpanzees' acquisition of new behavior form cannot be based on such an inflexible formula, but it is adaptation of new environment. Thus, a form for Miki is both technological and historical in character. In essence, it's not event. It is an event in the world of history. But one could even argue that spider's web in this quote, which looks like superb artwork, but are actually cozy technology according to Miki, resembles some of the reflecting images in Nishitani 1982 essay. Essentially, an image for Nishitani is neither historical nor technological. For example, Nishitani compares an image to changing weather embryo in a sea. An image and another image weaves into one another and give rise to a more comprehensive image, which then weaves together with other similar images. The breadth and depth of these interrelation of images constitute a highly delicate movement, like constantly changing weather across open space. The analogy to constantly changing weather is misguiding because it gives an erroneous impression that Nishitani contemplates a historical process. That is simply not the case because his point in the quote is that images are places rather than self-existent substances. The analogy to an embryo in a seed is more informative here. The fact that the form is an image yet to be seen, not simply an image not seen, does not concern Nishitani's theory of imagination. Next section, incidentality and technological form. I'd like to reiterate the distinction I made in my previous presentation in a workshop at Nanzan a year ago. Imagine, for example, the beginning of our usage of stone implements in the Stone Age. Presumably, the stone tools and arms were incidentally made and used without a sufficient conception of them ex ante. But for us, as ex-post observers now, the same tools have different character. That is, the theological character of these tools has become much clearer. In fact, it is difficult for us to even see their original incidentality. The theory of imagination Nishitani presented at the end of the 1982 essay is analogous to the view of these ex-post observers. The theory regards the technological innovation as a practical application of a pre-given form. But it's simply not true that one has an image in mind prior to an invention of the technological object. In the workshop, I also discussed Mickey's criticism of Friedrich Dessauer's theory of technology. To cut long story into short, in Mickey's reading of Dessauer, Dessauer misrepresents the historical nature of technological innovation. Here again, Mickey focuses on Dessauer's concept of pre-given forms. Mickey contends that technological form is not pre-given. Namely, it does exist prior to historical production. It does not exist prior to historical production. That is, a form does not have its substance, and meaning is determined retrospectively in history. It's worthwhile to discuss a few examples Mickey mentioned in logical imagination, such as automobile or bicycle. This is from logical imagination technology section. We have been so accustomed to these instruments in everyday life that we never doubt that there could have been various other forms of automobiles or bicycle, historical. There was no form prior to historical invention of automobile. However, once we get used to a particular kind of automobile, we tend to consider it to be natural, suitable for its purposes, and even forgiven. A form of automobile is not an epistemological discovery, but techno-historical invention. As Mickey himself writes in Philosophy of Technology, an idea is born when it is created. This is from 1942 text. In the workshop, I argued Dessauer's idea of technology is an ex-post rationalization of the course of incidental and ex-post history. And the reason he can posit technological form as pre-given is that he has chosen the standpoint from which an event is fully conceivable. On the contrary, for Mickey, a techno-historical form is essentially an ex-ante form, an overall picture of which is never foreseeable, but most strictly, conscious or not. Mickey has taken the standpoint from which the same technological event is to be seen differently from the Dessauer. So in Mickey's own words, the problem of technology is philosophically no other than the problem of form. And this form is historical form, namely that which is produced historically. A historical form of technology is not something that transcends experiences. So he states that technology is generated by eidetic form from within matter or nature. イデ的な形が 物質あるいは自然の中から出る。I think this is from logical imagination. From this perspective, Michi's philosophy technology is indistinguishable from his philosophical reflection of history. Now, did Nishitani take this point into consideration in the 1982 essay? My answer is clearly negative. Towards the end of the essay, Nishitani explained imagination with an example circle. When we learn geometry by drawing a circle or line or triangle on a blackboard or paper, we are actually seeing an invisible images or circle through visible quasi circle. The original doesn't have a quasi. And further, we are pursuing formless, purely conceptual knowledge of learning through this image. He then writes that the concept of a circle is made into a form of a circle in the realm of imagination, which is then given practical applications. Namely, gives rise to various tools and machines such as discs or wheels in the realm of sensation. Imagination for him, in other words, turns theoretical reason to practical reason, or the possibility of plugging the reality of the world experience. As Mickey put it in the quote in which he criticized this theory of technology. In short, for Nishitani, an innovation is the act of image mediating a concept and its practical application. Here, a form is conceived of separately from its historical materiality. This is precisely the reason for which Mickey criticized this hour in logical imagination, specifically on page 244. So Nishitani did not see that a form is a historical form, which arises from our techno-ontology. It is that inevitable that his notion of imagination is that of theory, not of praxis. And his attempt to relate kosoryoku, or even fundamental imagination, to other key concepts such as emptiness remains incomplete in the 1982 essay. I think this is the end of the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Oh, we can start to discuss or to put question to Professor Odagiri, the people on, of course, and or we in this room.
Yeah, a question if I can.
Yes.
In a certain point of your discussion, you said that for Nishitani, images are places rather than substances.
Can you speak louder? I can.
Yeah. In a certain point of your presentation, you said that for Nishitani, images are places rather than substances. In which sense they are places rather than substances? In which sense?
In which sense? Well, I'm just explaining his point. I don't remember a specific example in the text, but he says, 物が心になるみたいな sentence. There was a sentence like that in the text. If you, I don't have the original Japanese, but I'm simply referring to that stuff.
I don't know which page, but yes, the Japanese text.
Yeah, and some it's surprising that he's relating this place, but maybe we can call it place logic, to logical imagination, property imagination. But he does that in the essay, and I'm not quite defending him.
Any other questions? Oh, I would like to ask you, if no other people has questions, if you, Professor Odagiri, if you could say something about the relation of Miki to Nishida and of Nishitani to Nishida in this compare that you are doing. Because
in my understanding.
yeah, yes, of course. And the idea is, so you stress that there is a difference in the interpretation of the meaning of imagination. It was very clear, referring to Kant. He made this distinction that somehow for Miki, imagination is projected in the future, if I understand. Is imagination to do something, to change for something. Somehow it's a revolutionary, we could say. And on the other side, you said that imagination for Nishitani is conservative or is unhistorical because it's not an imagination to invent something that does not exist, but is. So the difference is Nishitani thinks that imagination is to create a build, what he called a build in the and
Imagination is create.
So Nishitani in his he said that Einbildungskraft is in order to make a build, an image in Kutosoku. An image is something where invisible, unhistorical, or eternal and sensible are made in one, like in haiku or basho, like in works of art, and so on. On the contrary, Miki used the not the word build, but the word form, as you said, and his imagination create a form, and form is something to do. And so, in doing so, Miki is referring to Nishida and said, I'm very, as far as I understand Nishida, I'm very near to Nishida, to Koiteki Chokan, to into the intuition or the world of oasis. So there is this aspect of creation, creativity, Nishida's thought. At the same time, you said this is not present in Nishitani Utosoku at all. Nevertheless, I think that also Nishitani's philosophy is very linked to Nishida for several aspects. So, if you could just to make the discussion go on,
Actually,
explain me how do you see the relation of Miki to Nishida and Nishitani to Nishida, for example, in connection with the topic of imagination?
I think the relation between Nishida and Miki is very essential for both. That's very clear. Right before. And Nishitani, it's true he mentioned such concept as justification and so forth. Somewhat in depth to Nishida conceptualization of experience. It's true, but how much he's very independent, if I can put that in a good word. But on the bus side of it, it seems to me, when I read this text, I don't know, I'm not a good reader of Nishitani, I guess, but I'm not reading much about him. I wasn't convinced by his argument. He's simply saying what seems reasonable, but it's not quite. And many examples, especially his reading of poetry, is almost arbitrary. His understanding of basho is not next to amateur either. And so I don't think I wouldn't even say she was influenced by Nishida, essentially.
So do you think that the concept of soku has nothing to do with Nishida dialectal thought, or the usage of Ichisokta, Soku, Ikitsu, these kinds are very present also in Nishida later philosophy?
He used these terminology, but he kind of take advantage of those Nishidian and use it in his own way. The meaning of Isokta Tasokuichi is much more complicated in Nishida than Nishitani. Yeah, I think Miki was trying to incorporate that complexity. I don't get impressions that impression reading. But at least from this step, I don't know if it's out of that. I only did Chikyoなんか、religion, But the only other text I know. But even that text, I'm not sure if I can say it, but no, I don't feel deep enough into that. That's my impression. So maybe there may be objections from Ohashi Sensei. Hitomi Sensei and so forth.
Ohashi Sensei is now present. We can.
He's not here.
Present. I'm
There.
You're here. Hello, Ohashi Sensei.
Jim, please.
Yes, I wonder about the connection between image and kosoryuku, which is translated as imagination. In English or in foreign translations, when we use those words the same, we assume that imagination is the creation of images, right? But Japanese uses, Nishitani uses completely different words. The kosoryoku, it means, is nothing to do with image. It means conceptualization. The image in his own language on page 154 is a keizo or a shinzo. So that's what we would call an image, right? So you're talking about the relation between conceptualization and images. And usually in psychology or in philosophy, we associate imagination with the creation of concrete keizo. It would be so souzoryu or keizoryu, something like that. So I'm wondering if maybe the translation causes some confusion, or if Nishitani had a specific reason why he didn't use the normal word for imagination when talking about images. So Japanese has a psychological term and a philosophical term for talking about imagination. Nishitani is talking about images, but he chooses not to use that. Is it in order to battle with Miki, or is there something else going on?
I may be mistaken, but I think he uses image in English as well sometimes.
Yes, yes, but the first time he uses it in parentheses, he explains what it means.
Shinzo, right?
And when he explains the kosoryoku, he says that's what we call kyotsu kankaku, so sensus communis. Right? That's what he says.
And even the Fulgorico can be translated
So imagination,
But is this? I think in the logic of the imagination, Mickey's using the same terminology. So if he's picking this up from Mickey, which I think is correct.
That's my question. If he wants to deal with
But the common sense, the word he uses for image and the word he uses for imagination, and the distinction he makes between imagination and fantasy, these are just right out of Mickey.
But it's probably coming from Miki. Yes. Using translation of imagination. Counting. That's where poetry comes from.
And Mickey uses the word right beside Einbildung.
I think he uses idee as well.
Yeah, to speak more.
I have to, we have to speak louder.
Yeah.
So, well, I think it's coming from Miki. And I think he has a reason to do that. And I think Nishitani and the other people were just following the convention of usage of that term to translate, especially Kantian notion of imagination into Japanese.
So Kant is the deciding figure there. Kant is the important element there that has to do with mind.
Well, Mickey's interesting 構想力 is mostly from Kantian.
So in John Kreml's new translation, I mean, this is one of the questions that John and I discussed at length. It's like, because I was asking about the same question, and his answer was, what can I do? Mickey has the German, and then he gives me the Japanese and says, this is this. And I'm stuck with it. So, and if you translate it in any other way than imagination, then you would lose the connection with Kant and the productive imagination. And I think Mickey is also turning to a consideration of the imagination in the early 30s, right after probably being exposed to the Kant book by Heidegger. And so it's a response or taking up of Heidegger's interpretation of the productive imagination in Kant. And I think that's what's going on clearly in the like by 32, 33 in other essays by Mickey. He's clearly engaging Heidegger on this question. And that's why I think that Nishitani is going to pick that up, because he's also going to want to keep that Heideggerian connection of the productive imagination.
But alternatively, we can translate into productive imagination, but that's probably too specific. Better to translate into imagination. With footnote, this means productive kind of imagination.
Professor Hashi, please.
I have one question, which could be very important. Mickey quotes many authors, many philosophers, like Valéry, Pascal, Kant, Dewey, and somehow also Cassirer, Horkheimer, and so forth. But not Heidegger. That has a reason. Heidegger has treated the problem of technique since the 50s in the last century, while Mickey has treated the technique from very early. And it is amazing that Mickey has paid attention to the problem of technique so early. Still, my question is, the first question, are you contented by the theory of technique of Mickey? The second question, which is connected to the first question, namely, Mickey has, in the published form of his book, he has treated methodology, institution, technique, and experience. And he has abandoned, or he has stopped to treat the problem of language in the fifth chapter, which was not published. Now, in the third chapter, Gijutsu, technique, he has mentioned the essence of technique. Not the phenomenons of technique, but the essence of technique. And just this essence of technique, that was a theme of Heidegger. Now, so far as I see, I'm not quite contented, not quite satisfied by the description of Mickey to the essence of technique. My question, how would you regard the essence of technique as is treated by Heidegger? And he has, as I have already said, he has treated the technique since 80s and 60s, and Mickey has not survived in this epoch. And if Mickey knows how Heidegger had treated the problem of technique, how would you think his possible view or opinion regarding the essence of technique? This is my question.
It's a question about to me or to anyone?
To both.
Well, so Heidegger technology, Heidegger's views of technology, those are very negative in the sense that he thinks of instrumentality of technology. Technology sees people as kind of instrumentality. Or Kantian term, it's using human being not as a purpose, but truthful purpose. Maybe that's one way to understand it. And that's probably historical, partly due to historical background, that he survived after the war and he experienced all those World War II tragedy, which is partly based on arising from some nature of technology. And Mickey didn't survive the World War II, or he did, but he barely survived, but he couldn't survive longer than that. And so if Mickey could survive after 1945, up until 1945, he's very rather positivistic about technology. And he is trying to he is trying to use technology to make his own philosophical point. So technology is very positive concept for him. But after the war, probably somewhat following Heidegger, he might become more negative. He might see some negative aspects of technology, such as atom bomb and so forth. That's my guess, and I hope I'm answering your question.
No, not at all.
At all.
First, Heidegger. For Heidegger, the essence of technique is at the same time the essence of European metaphysics. And the phenomenon regarding the instruments that are not the essence of the technique, but phenomenons of technique. And second, Heidegger was not quite negative to the technique. What he has tried was how the essence of technique as the essence of metaphysics could be a new grasped, and how the human being in the modern age can open the positive perspective to the technique. And this problem is not a technical problem, but combined with the problem of the essence of metaphysics, which is the destiny of the European world, which is at the same time, in view of Heidegger, at the same time, the destiny of the modern world. So the background of Heidegger's thought, which is connected to the problem of the essence of technique, could be somehow compared also with some views of Nishida to the problem of technique. And so far as I have understand Mickey, in his view, which he has expressed till the end, till 1945, and luckily he has died in the prison. The range of the view of the technique for Heidegger and for Miki is quite different, or in other words, to say in other words, Miki remains in his quite sensitive consciousness of the period. He was aware of the serious problem of technique, but not yet. He has not thought that the essence of technique has more larger range of the problem, and that is the point which I miss for in Miki's theory. So my question regarding the essence of technique is a point which is not quite answered by you.
Well, technology has a very wide-ranging meaning. So you could say handcraft is technology and also atomic marking technology. Those are two very different kinds of technology. And in the 1930s and 40s, both Nishida and Miki had in mind relatively simple concept of technology. Mostly, we could say they have in mind handicraft kind of technology and use it as a model for action intuition. So this is very positive aspect of technology for both Miki and Nishida, and possibly for Heidegger too. And but that doesn't simply extend to much more systematic or scientifically oriented technology, such as atomic bomb and other much artificial intelligence and so forth. But far more uncontrollable than handicraft technology. And this situation, technology situation of now post-war world is very different from Nishida, when Nishida and Miki was thinking about it. And that's one thing we should think about, the technology after Miki and Nishida. That's all I can say, if anybody can add to this.
Don't you think it's unfair to bring in Heidegger's view of technology, which is all about being, right? That there's a kind of depletion of being, the technological, the Gestell, as he calls it, the technological inframing of the world, which is a kind of a destiny we're faced with. And it includes the atom bomb, and it includes many other things, but they're all revealing a depletion of being. Now, I don't think the Japanese philosophers are necessarily thinking of that. I mean, when Nishitani talks about nihilism, does he deal with technology, and does he deal with it in a dialogue with Heidegger's view of technology? I mean, of course, there's many meanings to the word technology, but Heidegger has a very specific one, the technique, which is not really translatable simply as technology. It's a certain disposition of the world we're living in, which is a loss of authentic being, a loss of full being of things. But I would think Buddhism, with its concept of emptiness or of absolute nothingness, would have other fish to fry. I mean, it's not necessarily concerned with Heidegger's being. It might not be interested in that at all. A Buddhist who approaches technology might have a totally different sense of its dangers, its promise and its dangers. I don't know what Nishitani said about technology. Did he connect it with nihilism?
I don't recall any example he specifically discussed technology. Anybody about it? or maybe Oha Sensei
Sorry, I
might.
didn't catch that. Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
Oh, sorry. I don't recall any specific example in which Nishitani discussed technology. And I asked people in the room whether anybody knows any specific example.
Not only in the room, but also on Zoom.
Yeah, yeah. It's pretty clear he is not much interested in science. I'm not a good leader of Nishitani, but I'm up, so I'm asking. Am I correct, Oha Sensei?
Is it a question to me?
I'm asking, yeah. Was Nishitani very interested in science and technology?
So far as I understand, Nishitani impresses always, many times, the significance of science and combined with technology in the modern age. And though the problem of technique was not thematized in the sense that technology technique became a title of one of his books or articles, but it was also the case with the conversation with me with him. He has stressed the importance of science because the science, the spirit of the science, and the spirit or destiny of the modern world is, in German to say, untrennbar, inseparable. And it could be one Aufgabe, what to say, Aufgabe in English, task. Task to in German, herausstellen, what to say, herausstellen. Robert, what to say, Robert? Herausstellen in English. The
maybe expose. Exhibit.
I would say in German, someone could translate my
expose, exhibit.
Exhibition. Yeah.
Exhibition. Es wäre eine wichtige Aufgabe, den Gedanken Nishitanis zur Technik herauszustellen, obwohl das Problem der Technik nicht thematisiert hat. Aber immerhin, betonte immer wieder die Bedeutung und Bedeutsamkeit, Signifikanz der Technik und Wissenschaft. Ne? So, therefore, it will be, es wäre interessante Aufgabe, den Gedanken Nishitanis zur Technik in his in wichtigen Punkten herauszustellen. So, Robert, bitte.
Shall I translate your comment?
Yeah.
Washi Sensei said it would be important to exhibit the understanding of technology in Nishitani's thinking, although he's not explicitly connect the notion of technique with his understanding and his understanding of the importance of science in his philosophy.
I think it's 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, Professor Odagiri, and we can move further to the presentation of
Just note there is a discussion of technology on pages 80 to 84 of this. He talks about technology, but I'm not sure what he's saying exactly. The emergence of the machine marks the supreme emancipation from the rule of the laws of nature, the supreme apparition of freedom in using those laws. In the machine, the work of man is completely objectified. Purpose of human agency is incorporated within nature as part of the things of nature, and thereby the control over nature is radicalized. It is a rule over nature more far-reaching than the self-rule of nature itself, and so on. That's a discourse which hard to figure out exactly where it's heading.
Thank you very much. So we have to move to Emma Lavinia Wall. Then we can, after the presentation, we can go further also with the discussion of topic of art or technology or technique. So, if you are ready,
Yes.
you want to share the screen or?
Yes, just wanted to share the brief handout that I prepared for this presentation. Just give me a second. Wait a second. Sorry. Right. Trying to. So should be. Sorry, just can't find on the sharing option.
Wait a moment.
Just a second. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Just. Okay, you just. It says that I can't share any content.
Now you should try be able to share. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Now you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, but you see the handout or a text?
The text. The with text. Now the handout, I think.
Now the handout and now the text.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Okay, but it's fine because this is like the text I just wanted to read, but there are also the quotations, so it's fine. Okay, so I just starting. So in my brief presentation, I just wanted to focus on the first half of this selected text by Nishitani, so emptiness and sameness. In particular, I want to focus on this relationship between ku, so void, emptiness, and language. So I just want to try to facing the question of poetry and the very structure of writing. Also because in this text, Nishitani speaks about grammar and gram, also making a sharp distinction between those two words. And so as Nishitani explains, this experience of ku, of happiness, is something that must happen within the world and within the worldly, the empirical, the sensible forms. I think this is really an important element in his reflection, because within the world, he says one can experience what is not a linguistic form in itself, but is the genetic background of everything in the world. So the background that springs in a way that may seem maybe paradoxical from within what it simultaneously surrounds. So we have this kind of double, we can say, implication by which the experience of emptiness is something which produces itself in the realm of, Nishitani says, the concrete. And so I think that this word, concrete, is really the actual key word, we can say, in these reflections by Nishitani. And so he also made this very important example of the sky. So koku, void, emptiness, and ku, which means both emptiness and sky. So koku is empty sky, and he says it is emptiness which surrounds the sensible and the empirical world, and which we can, of course, grasp with our sight, so with our senses. And so koku, he says, is the place where one can have a concrete, once again, experience of the void. So an experience from within the concrete, a concrete experience of emptiness. And so this, as I read the text, this does not mean that this experience is not total and absolute experience of the void just because it is from within the world. But on the contrary, it is properly because this experience springs from within the world that this experience is really real. It's total and absolute experience of emptiness. And so Nishitani says, and this is another point that I really want to stress because I think it's really crucial in his reflection. The empty sky is not a mere metaphor and is not a mere analogy. So there is, we can say, a non-metaphorical and a non-analogical sense by which ku is koku, by which void, emptiness, is concretely the empty sky. Also because analogy is something which implies, we can say, a substitution of a term with another, which of course is linked to the first, but still analogy is a form of substitutive thinking, and of course a form of logical thinking. So Nishitani makes this really interesting discussion on logos, the Greek logos, because he says, of course, logos means both the thing and language. It also means rational reasoning. But of course, Nishitani suggests that the concreteness, as we said, of this experience, which is more, he says, than logical and rational, puts ku and koku, so void and the empty sky, in a relationship which is not the one, we can say, of substitution. So it's not that the empty sky is an analogical or metaphorical substitute of void, but this is a relation, we can say, of mutual immanence. And so at the same time, I think that also Nishitani suggests that logos is not reducible to the mere meaning of rationality or logical language, because there is a form, we can say, a mode, a modality, a declination of logos, a function of logos, that it is in itself a concrete place from within which it's possible to have this experience of emptiness. And this is precise, at least in the example he brings in this text, poetry. And also through a peculiar, we can say, a peculiar way of employing grammar and syntaxis. So I just wanted to read and to share one of the poems that Nishitani shares and analyzes in the text, which is a poem by Meng Haoran, At the Retreat of Monk Yi Gong. Just going to read it briefly. Monk Yi Gong makes it a practice to meditate. Here in the hut he has built in the empty forest. Outside his door is a towering mountain peak. In front of his step, proudly made deep valleys. The rays of the setting sunshine threw a passing shower and cast the shadow of the empty verdure on the yard. When I see the pure lotus blossom, more fully I understand his unstained heart. And so in this poem, I think that the point is that there is this immanent and concrete link between the emptiness of the forest, the emptiness of the verdure, and the unstainedness of the heart of the monk. So the purity, the emptiness of the heart of the monk is reflected in the concrete emptiness of the forest or of the verdure. And so this is a real imaging of the experience of grasping ku, of grasping the void, emptiness, from within the empirical and concrete world. And so it is we can say, a concrete experience of void within the concrete. And in this sense, I think that there is a double concreteness, we can say, a sort of reduplication by which ku is reflected in the concreteness of the forest, and this immanent relation itself is reflected in the concreteness of poetry and writing. This is really interesting. So we have this double concreteness, one inserted into the first. Of course, this means that also poetry and writing are places where ku is concretely made manifest and accessible. And so I just want to try to shed more light on this point in a comparative fashion, hoping that would be interesting for you, also for having a conversation later. And I've chosen this very beautiful poem by Paul Celan with an Italian title, which is Mandorla. In German is Mandel. In English it means almond. And I'm just going to read the English translation. In the almond, what dwells in the almond? Nothing. Nothing dwells in the almond. There it dwells and dwells. In nothing, what dwells there? The king. There dwells the king. The king. There he dwells and dwells. So I think that this is really interesting, also in a comparative fashion with the other poem we already read, because in Christian art, generally the resurrected Christ is depicted in church portals, but also in other points, in other part of the internals of the church, inside, like in an almond-like shape, in an oval shape, and this is precisely the almond. And Celan finds out this kind of identification of Christ, the König, the king, and das Nichts, nothing, void, emptiness. And also here we have again, I think, this double reduplication of the concrete place of void, because the almond and the poem itself, as a written trace, are places where it's possible to experience this kind of religious void. Of course, the void Paul Celan is talking through Christian tradition, and the void that Nishitani is describing, ku, are also different, maybe kind of voids. So also, this is an interesting point we can discuss later. But I just wanted to stress out this idea of this reduplication of the concreteness, of the concrete place where we can have experience of void. And also, this kind of experience, Nishitani points out, has a spiritual meaning. So poetry reaches the boundaries of logos, Nishitani says, and opens up immediately to religion, or we can say to mystic transfiguration and realization. So there is like we can say an excess inside inside the logos, that through poetry, that through this experience of opening this void inside language, passive in another, we can say in another dimension of meaning, which is precisely religious, he says. And also in this sense, I think it would be interesting a brief comparison with this very famous extract from the Chandogya Upanishad, which of course is not like properly a poem, but a text which we can say that the ultimate goal is helping the reader through the realization path. I'm just going to read it briefly. It's a dialogue between Uddalaka and Shvetaketu. Shvetaketu is the son of Uddalaka. So bring me a fruit from the banyan tree. Here is one, father. Break it open. It is broken, father. What do you see there? These tiny seeds. Now break one of them open. It is broken, father. What do you see there? Nothing, father. My son, you know there is a subtle essence which you do not perceive, but through that essence the truly immense banyan tree exists. Believe it, my son. Everything that exists has itself in that subtle essence. It is truth. It is the self. And you, Shvetaketu, are that. So it's like the very famous Sanskrit sentence, Tattvamasi, who art you? And I think it's interesting because also in this very brief extract, we have somehow this kind of experience of nothingness, this experience of a void, which in the Upanishad is identified with the self, with the Atman. So of course, it's a really diverse comprehension of void and of emptiness in regard to Nishitani's idea. But once again, I just wanted to stress and to focus on this kind of, we can say, operation within language and writing, by which we have this attempt to grasp something through a concrete form, which can be that of writing, and inside writing, another concrete form, in this case, the seed of the banyan tree that breaks. And so what's important here, of course, is to realize the sameness of the individual ego and the true self, which is also this nothingness inside everything. So as the poem we read at the beginning of the presentation, so this void inside the verdure, this void inside the forest, also here in this extract from Chandogya, is inside the seed and inside the self, just like it was inside the heart of the monk. And so once again, we have this kind of reduplication in the concrete. So in this sense, just trying to go a little bit more deep in this kind of relationship between language, writing, and the void, I think that there is a really interesting relationship between language and writing on one side and void, emptiness on the other side. So it's like that writing or poetry produces itself as a concrete expression of void, and in the other sense, void is made concrete, is made real through its manifestation through the written words. So we have this double kind of relationship. And I also found out this really fascinating extract from the I Ching that illustrates this genetic relationship between void and writing. And in this case, the void is represented precisely by the surface of the sky. So again, we have this koku we discussed in the beginning. I'm just going to read it's the last one. When in early antiquity Pao Xi ruled the world, he looked upward and contemplated the image in the heavens. He looked downward and contemplated the patterns on the earth. He contemplated the markings on birds and beasts and the adaptations to the regions. He proceeded directly from himself and indirectly from objects. Thus, he invented the 8 trigrams in order to enter into connection with the virtues of the light of the gods and to regulate the condition of all beings. So, in this brief extract from I Ching, the emperor invents writing, watching the surface of the sky, watching this koku, as it is a sort, we can say, of transcendental surface where there are some traces, like stars and constellations. And so this means that, and it's really interesting, that writing itself is born from void. And so this is something that in Chinese and Japanese art and calligraphy is maybe very well represented. It's very strong, also Nishitani says in a certain point of the text, but that in a certain sense, Western writing and also Western art maybe has somehow just covered also the linear type of writing, alphabetic writing, just leave no space for the void to emerge, to be perceived. And so lastly, I just want to analyze briefly poetry from Mallarmé, in particular his poem Un coup de des, which means like yeah, I miss the English word for like
dice.
Yeah, precisely, thank you. And so, however, in this poem by Mallarmé, we can see how the power of void emerges again in the concrete, in this case from the white page, which is once again this transcendental surface of writing. And so there is this quotation by French poet Paul Valéry, which is very iconistic in this sense, and he says that Mallarmé, with this poem, with its graphic, very graphic, we can say this is like a scan of the poem. With this effect, he has, Valéry says, elevated a page to the power of the starry sky. So again, the sky as an image of void and source of writing. So as we can say, Mallarmé tries to say and to express something, not only through the words, but also through what maybe Nishitani may call this gram, this synthetic unity of the poem, which is something that can express a meaning, that can communicate and open up this void, this emptiness, not only through the meaning, through the signification of words, but also through its peculiar form, its graphic organization. So we can say all of those big holes between words make the void, make the emptiness of the surface of the page, of the white page, emerge. Thus, in this sense, making possible to have another time this concrete experience of void Nishitani speaks. So I just wanted to make this maybe a little bit big and interculturally expressed reflection, and just hope can be of any help for the discussion of this very beautiful and profound extract by Nishitani. And so thank you for your attention. I finished.
Thank you, Emma. So if you can stop sharing the screen, we can start the discussion. So please, if you have questions, comments. Washi-sensei, please. And then after Washi-sensei, Robert Lehman, is coming right. Okay, Washi-sensei first.
Thank you for your beautiful presentation. I have two simple questions. The first, you have said that at the beginning, the emptiness happens within the world. Would you also say that the world happens within the emptiness? If yes, I will agree with you. That's my first question. And the word happening, that is quite interesting word for me. That is my first question. And the second question, you have treated the writing and also mentioned the calligraphy.
Mhm.
Would you think that the writing is not only the written language, written letters, but also the action with body and soul? Calligraphy, it can be, of course, regarded as the written letters with pin, in German, Pinsel, Pinsel. But at the same time, the calligraphy is an action in which the personality of the author is also expressed. And well, I think about Hisamatsu Shinichi, the colleague of Nishitani, the Zen Buddhist, and he has made many calligraphies. And he also says that just in the action of writing a calligraphy, he is empty. And I would like to know, how do you think about the writing as action with body and soul? That's my second question.
Yes. Do I have to wait the question by Robert Lehman, or can I answer to Sensei?
I think you can answer first.
Okay. Thank you so much for your question. I totally agree with you. Concerning the first one, of course, there is this double implication between the worldly forms and void, by which, as you said, there is like an experiencing of void inside the worldly form, but also the worldly form springs from the void. And so, of course, in my reading, void, it's something genetic, it's something positive. It's the very place, of course, just using this word that also my colleague before me used, and that is really, really important in Nishitani and in Nishida as well. Void is the really active place where things springs and are creatively reflected. And so, of course, there is this double implication, because if we just stop when we have the experience of emptiness inside the world, if we just stop in emptiness, we can no more understand the world. And so also I think that the really spiritual experience, it's not only an experience of, we can say, annihilation of extinction, total extinction in the void, but also it is an experience of this dynamic oscillation between void on one side and the worldly form in the other side. If I just stay in the void, I can no more understand the world. And so I have to make this oscillation. And concerning the second question, I really wanted to mention, but finally I just thought I wouldn't have time enough to, that also I didn't know about Nishitani, but I knew that Nishida used to paint a lot of words with like calligraphy, and especially the word mu, Japanese mu. There are a lot of calligraphies by Nishida where he just paint and paint and paint in different fashions this ideogram. And I think that, of course, the goal is precisely that while I am painting, while I am tracing, this becomes a concrete experience of void, of emptiness for myself. And I think that this is really interesting because also practice, as you rightly said, is a concrete place. From within, I can experience emptiness. So not only the form as forma formata in Latin, as a form that is already formed and fixed, and I just have to contemplate. This is something also really Western in a certain sense. It can be the occasion to an experience of void or of emptiness, but also, of course, action. Koiteki chokkan, we said with Nishida. Of course, I have to do something. And maybe in a certain sense, also the contemplation of a work of art is action, is a form of practice in a certain sense. So yes, I just totally agree, and thank you for your questions. Hope I answered.
And Robert Lehman, I think.
Thank you so much.
Say something, please.
I found it very inspiring, especially the concept of double concreteness, because the problem of reduplication is, I like the idea that it's applicable as well on the dimension of form as on the dimension of content, so to speak, because it allows to say something about the relationship of logic and poetry in a certain sense, because there's this what well known, it's not really a problem, but it is annoying to some logicians that obviously two negations can provide an affirmation, where no two affirmations, but very rarely in logic, provide a negation. But this is just a problem of logical representation, so to speak. Two affirmations cannot represent a negation, but they for sure can express some. And so I was very glad to see that you choose Celan's poem, because I think that's a perfect example for exactly that you have a repetition or Wiederholung that in its purest sense in the end is in a sense the expression of a negation through two affirmation. And this still stays annoying for logicians, but it's a beautiful thing. And it's the first time I could really see it in a poem as soon as I thought about it, which is a nice experience in itself. So thank you very much for that. And I've not really have a question. I was just very happy to share that with you. But if I should formulate a question, it would be, can you see from your experience with especially this text with Nishitani, where he makes use, so to speak, of this power of expression and imagination to a certain degree in his development of philosophy? Because, you know, we have this interesting problem that it's kind of a tension between obviously the possibility to skip into a religious or mystical experience, which can be provided at the edge of poetry, so to speak, but it still remains an expression of philosophy. So at least we have to find a way to bring these things together in our conceptualization of what we're doing when we're doing philosophy. So yeah, I would be interested in how you would address this problem of where stands philosophy in between these two.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for firstly for your very kind and interesting observations. Of course, I think that the point is precisely for Nishitani, but not only, to describe this peculiar mechanism by which poetic language can, as also with Mallarmé, we have seen, can communicate something, can evocate something, not only with saying it, but with this operation that Nishitani calls gram. So I don't know actually the Japanese word. In the English translation, it's called gram, which it's a word that Nishitani uses just to distinguish from grammar. And of course, he says grammar is something that works with logic, but there is something that is not only logical. And I think that an important point of the text, and also maybe just going back to the question of technology that was brought in the conversation before my talk, he says we have to go beyond intelligence. I think that this is really, really an important point, because if we take artificial intelligence, maybe it's not a technique in an Heideggerian sense, because artificial intelligence, EA, is something that just developed later. But I think it's really interesting because, of course, a machine, a computer, makes use of intelligence. We cannot no more deny it. But Nishitani says we have to go beyond intelligence. There is something beyond intelligence. I think that this is, if we want just to discuss later, it's a really, really interesting point. And I think he's totally right, because machine cannot experience emptiness. It can describe emptiness in a very also intelligent way, making use of language, but it can't have experience of emptiness. So maybe Nishitani can, I'm sorry, I'm just, and now I go back to the point, but I think that maybe Nishitani does not talk about those kind of stuff explicitly, but he can help us to think out these questions. But going back to your question, I also asked myself when I was while I was reading the text, well, so he's just telling us poetry is a concrete place where the void can be grasped, religion as well, but where is philosophy in this sense? So is philosophy still a place where void or emptiness or ku is possible to be experienced or not? Or we have to overcome philosophy in religion. I think that the very problem here is that, of course, the distinction between philosophy and religion, it's something really, really Western. I mean, if you in Indian tradition, for example, this distinction is not really really defined. Of course, there are some tendencies that are more like religious, like bhakti and something like that. There are tendencies like Nyaya Vaisheshika that are more like logic kind of, but they are all projected to the possibility, the chance to have somehow a spiritual experience. So, And also, I think that the Chinese and Japanese traditional philosophy has something similar in this sense. So it's difficult to really separate religion and philosophy. In Western tradition, this is a problem, of course. In Nishitani texts, as you asked, I think that is precisely in his use of language that we can see how philosophy can be the source of an experience that maybe is beyond philosophy itself, but as it is also beyond religious texts, because also religious texts are written to advocate an experience that goes beyond the text, through and within the text. And so I think that it is precisely in Nishitani use of language that we can find this kind of operation. The word soku is an example, because it means at the same time this and that, but also this separate from, it's like sameness, but not like logical identification. And so I think that maybe it's precisely in Nishitani's use of language that we can find a convergence of religion and philosophy in this sense. But it's just an idea.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of time right now, right?
Yes. If there are other questions, Tobias?
No. Okay.
Can I say
yes.
something?
But we have time till 6 o'clock.
Yes.
So, okay.
I have a question.
Professor O'Leary and then Pier Giacomo, it's okay?
Hello. It's amazing that in Western literature, the void emerges at top points. I mean, Celan always eating away at language and coming on the things. And Mallarmé, his most radical poem, ends with the words, Rien n'aura eu lieu que le lieu. Nothing will have happened than the space which is something at the core of Plato. And there's a very interesting book by Shunko Matoba on Beckett's Yohaku, where she talks about the empty, dark spaces in Beckett's plays as a kind of representation of Buddhist emptiness. Not that he intended it as such, but that's what happens. So is there room for a much more Buddhist reading of these poems, these poets, which are all very puzzling and very tantalizing? And how do we read them in a Buddhist way without appropriating them illegitimately, without wrapping them up in some Buddhist system, but also without missing the spiritual depth of their vision of reality? It's not just nihilism. I mean, people often think that poets like that who talk about the void, or sculptors like Giacometti who evoke the void, are some kind of nihilist. But a Buddhist reading could bring out that this is not nihilism. This is something more substantial. That's a contradiction. Something more fundamental. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I think thank you also for recalling the other poem by Stéphane Mallarmé, which in a certain sense maybe it's also closer to Nishitani because of this idea of place. And yeah, I think it's really interesting. Of course, I think that the problem that we in the West we have in Western metaphysics with void, of course, is that it's so easy for us to consider it as nothing, as Abgrund, as like the indifferentiated, where all the differences are just eliminated and just leaving space only to a nihilist way of thinking. I think that the point is precisely, and I think that in Mallarmé it's quite evident, is to understand that void is something affirmative too, not negative. It's not the place where the forms are negated, but it's like a genetic field. That's why I spoke about transcendental surface. The idea by which the white page can be devoid as the transcendental surface that makes it possible for writing to exist. Because if I do not have this white, pure and transcendentally void and empty surface, I cannot write anything. And so I think that the key to how can I say overcome this very false, in a certain sense, and misleading interpretation by which void is nothing, it's absence, because void is not, it's not absence. There is not an absence, it's something different. It's precisely to see how void can be a transcendental source for the forms to exist. And so, yeah, of course, there are, I think, other examples. Mallarmé, it was the first one that it came to my mind. But yeah, also if you take like some maybe Kazimierz Malievich paintings, Malievich, where you have, for example, these white squares or black squares with they are like void surfaces, but that are perceived in a creative way. Or, for example, also in Italy, Lucio Fontana, that was an artist that he tried to, how can I say, to cut the tissue of the work of art, just to make this, like the background emerge, and so to make it perceivable, the very background of the piece as this void that is the source for the presence to be. So I think, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
So, very short, one last question, Giacomo.
Yeah, I have both a question and a remark. So thank you for this talk, which was really inspiring to me, especially for the point of view that you used. The question is, you said that there is this sort of dialectic between the void space, and the worldly form. And you conclude we cannot just focus on the void. We also have to do something, because if we just focus on the void, then we lose the world. So my question is, from a moral point of view, or even from an ethical point of view, which maybe it's better in this case, which could be the implications of this dialectic that you remarked? So, in other words, you were saying about the white page that you are enhancing with this point of view. My question would be, what are the rules for writing something on this white page once you discover, you consider this white page? Then the first remark, I worked on something really similar. So yeah, I think I can say something about this. First of all, there is this sort of definition that you can get from the women philosophers who worked in the 20th century, starting from Kant, who tried to overcome Kant and to go beyond him. That they all reached the conclusions that a good answer to my question, but yeah, from a Western point of view, would be a sort of active contemplation. And yeah, it's interesting that you can find this active contemplation in many of these women philosophers, even if they didn't talk with each other. So this should mean something. And the second first thing is that regarding this fact of writing and poetry or every form of art, which can say something more than the reasoned word, than the word that comes from logos, no, or the philosophical word even. There is this interesting definition from Karl Jaspers, which is rational logic. So he was, and it's weird that when I had to write an article regarding this, there was nearly no English translation for this word. So this means that maybe it's something on which we should reason much more and publish much more. But yeah, alogic means that it's not illogical without logic, but alogic with a different logic. So something that lets something more come out. And probably this stuff of nothingness is making reason, making logos void. So doing something so that logos goes a step back in order to let this other stuff emerge, but still being present, sorry. And this is the situation when philosophy comes in again. So it can contemplate, again, the active receptivity, the active contemplation. He contemplates, it makes this step back, but then comes again for reasoning on what he saw, on what it saw. And maybe this is even more than what religion can do. So this could be the specific role of philosophy. But yeah, this is all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the questions. Yeah, well, of course, it's not sufficient to say you have to stay in this if I use the word dialectics, I am sorry because I really didn't want to. I don't remember if I actually used it or not, but of course I want to avoid like Hegelian kind of dialectics. I think that something different. And of course it's not sufficient to say yes, okay, you have to stay in this dynamic oscillation between the void on one side and the worldly forms on the other, because of course in a certain sense doesn't mean nothing. Of course we have to understand what does it mean precisely to stay in this dynamic oscillation. And I think that the meaning, one of the possible meaning and concrete actualization in the world of this kind of experience is precisely that which we have to consider and to act within the world, knowing that the worldly forms are, in a very Buddhist sense, are no substantial, are impermanent. And so we have to act knowing that all the forms are just, they just are placed in the void, in this void. This means that they cannot stay eternally, that they are transitory, that we don't have to identify ourselves with the worldly forms. Also because our self, of course, is placed in the void. So also our self, not in the sense of the Atman, of course, but in the sense of the ego. It's something that it's not substantial, it's not eternal. And so maybe somehow, if I have to use a word from Western tradition and from Heidegger, just because we talked about Heidegger a little bit, Gelassenheit. So let it happen. Also happen, this word that also Sensei Yoashi used, happening, the ereignis, the event, the happening, l'accadere in Italian, ac, this preposition, cadere in Italian means to fall. Knowing that everything falls from the void, but also returns to the void. And during all the journey of his life, it stays also in the void. And so I think that maybe this can be like an ethical meaning, an ethical sense. I would not talk about like a moral sense, because for me, but it's me, moral, it's something that it's still linked to like logical use of thinking and of language, and it is something that it is still fixed in the dimension of the conventions, and in the dimension of the meaning. And here I think that we are talking about like a more transcendental and original dimension that comes before that one of the moral. I don't know if I answered to you, hoping so. Of course, I also think that not to letting all of those to be only words, we have to practice it. So we have to realize this every day. So in our life, I think that, of course, this is the only possible way. Of course, also philosophy is a form of practice. It depends how you practice it. If for you philosophy is only like a work, you have to write something, to discuss something. Of course, this is not, how can I say, a way to concretely make somehow a more deep experience. But if philosophy becomes an exercise, I remember at one time I was talking with Enrico of Jacques Derrida, and he told me, yes, you know, Derrida used to wake up very early every morning and writing, and then at a certain hour he just stopped and he could start the day. This means that writing can be a form of meditation, as also Sensei Yoashi said. So yeah, that's
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we can move to the final presentation of today. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you already understood, we had to change our program, and actually now should be the time of the presentation of Marcello Ghilardi, but because of some problems he cannot attend. But we have the opportunity that Tobias can make his presentation from now on.
Send you the PDF file to your email. Can you?
Okay, so we can make
should be on your Gmail.
Yes, 2 minutes of pause, and then we can start. I prepare.
Okay.
So we can stop for a couple of minutes. So we are ready to start the final presentation. And, yes, I will share the screen. We can start.
Okay, so I will read my text. In this short tentative presentation, I will mainly focus on the wall. The wall as decisive site of encounter, or even as I will argue, conflict between Buddhism and Christianity in Nishitani. I will proceed in 2 steps. First, a few general recapitulatory remarks on the logic of soku. Second, a reflection on Nishitani's remarks on the religious encounter between Buddhism and Christianity in Kuto Soku. First, the title of Nishitani's essay. The conjunctive particle between ku and soku, to, and the title of Nishitani's dense essay, Kuto Soku, is essential to me. A rethinking of logic through the Buddhist thought of soku requires or necessarily entails a rethinking of ontology through ku, emptiness. On the level on which Nishitani's thought operates, both dimensions, logic and ontology, become indistinguishable and inseparable before they give way to an entirely new dimension, with so-called unhindered reason finally piercing through the vast sea of all laws, co-originating with all things, only finding its limit in the opening up of the world of unhindered things, primeval chaos and stubborn reality of things, all manifold being taking place beyond any contradiction in emptiness, which for Nishitani is revealed and expressed through a logic of soku and defines the religious experience in faith and awakening. I have to remark that I stick to the English translation of Marra. Nishitani elaborates the logic of soku through evoking the topological image of a plank, ita, between 2 rooms, a partition between 2 spaces, a wall. I take some liberty in inferring the image of the wall. A whole dialectic of walls will unfold. Nishitani will carefully build up what he describes as a decisive transgression of formal logic and concrete logic, ontologically or epistemologically. First, there is a compartmentalization of the world. Each of the myriad of things is walled off against each other, while at the same time appearing for each other, precisely mutually sharing their borders. This is the domain of ordinary reason or scientific theory, discriminating between discrete and distinct entities, parts and particulars, and their variable relations within the world. With a focus on the essential partitions between things, simultaneously separating and joining them together, the dialectical trajectory leads Nishitani to the relation of one and many, appearing as the relation of a sum to its parts, as the place of manifold being. There are walls between the elements of the world. Things appear as manifold in interdependence and mutual permeation, revolving around each other, appearing and disappearing, revolvingly reciprocal, egoteki, in seemingly infinite complexity. Nishitani calls the experience of facing this complexity of being taking place as a totality, both one as many and many as one, with a Buddhist expression, unhindered reason. The page numbers also refer to Marra's translation. From the relation between the opening of the world as total thing and the many things and laws taking place in the limited compartments of the world, Nishitani will advance to the absolute one, which can no longer be appropriately defined as a mere summation of particulars or a set of elements, and therefore neither as the place of the world as totality, giving place to the manifold being of things and laws. When confronted with the absolute one, unhindered reason faces another kind of wall. To borrow another expression from Nishitani, which I will return to in a different context later, unhindered reason here faces the iron wall of non-revolving reciprocity, all beings taking place as a stubborn reality, or, in the words of the poem, Nishitani quotes, the bottom of loneliness has not yet fallen off. Everything will then depend on the introduction of a new form of negation to enter into the stubborn reality of being taking place as this totality of all things and all laws co-originating. A certain dislocation is required to experience the opening of world from within as the unhindered things, the absolute one as emptiness of neither one as many, nor many as one. The wall marks the middle way which Nishitani's thought traverses towards such a negation. With the thought of being as totality, all logical categories begin to move in extraordinary fashion, as is also evinced by the text of Nishitani himself. Logic is no longer applied only secondarily to particular objects already given. Logic and its laws are observed in their essential linkage with being itself. All things and all laws originally one. As mentioned above, for Nishitani, this defines the domain of unhindered reason. Ontology on this level is necessarily a reflection on the conditions of logic, the conditions of the applicability of the laws of logic to any object whatsoever, and logic becomes the immediate expression of the fundamental categories of being. Nishitani's way of thinking overcomes the binary of so-called classical logic, a logic based on an Aristotelian frame of thought. I know I use this term Aristotelian purely as a convenient generalization, although it is indisputable that logic in the Western tradition of thought has its origin in Aristotle. Inside this frame, between being and nothingness, there is no middle. When thought reaches its highest point of speculative power, beings are contemplated in their totality, the world as cosmos, a whole which per definition necessarily excludes, and I take this word here literally, nothing or nothingness. For the Western philosophical tradition, this ontology expresses itself at its highest point as a logical dilemma, either being or nothingness. And this, of course, is exclusive. And it is furthermore historically demonstrable that from its Greek inception until the modern meditations of Heidegger onwards, there has consistently remained, as Nishitani famously noted, an overarching metaphysical preference for being over nothingness. Being assumes priority over nothingness with implications and consequences that extend far beyond the level of dry metaphysical speculations, taken as merely one abstract discipline of knowledge among others. Insofar as metaphysics functions as a foundational thinking, such ontological inclinations as towards a prevalence of being over nothing define the parameters for any knowledge of anything whatsoever, and they give direction to and determine all words, things, or deeds taking place inside such a frame of mind. On the other hand, for Nishitani, ultimately, when looking at the world as a whole, the image of the wall as a separating and at the same time joining element between two spaces closed in themselves can serve to illustrate a paradoxical point of coincidence of identity and difference, a suspension of the law of contradiction through a subversion of the law of the excluded middle. Here, precisely the middle is included and becomes the decisive object of thought through the logic of soku, unhinderedness. Drawing on the Buddhist tradition, the dilemma between being and nothingness will then give way through a complex dialectic to a tetralemmatic way of thinking. The logic of soku is explicitly a tetralemmatic logic. Tetralemmatic logic, in contradistinction to the dilemma between affirmation of being and negation of nothingness, describes a thought unfolding and moving through four distinct lemmata, from affirmation to negation, to both affirmation and negation, to neither affirmation nor negation. It is obvious that any thinking can make use of any of these lemmata, at least in a trivial sense, to produce truthful propositions, even strictly within an Aristotelian frame. However, when thought reaches its highest power, touching upon being itself, the whole of being and its logical relation to nothingness, then the question which lemma ultimately assumes priority becomes crucial. Seen from this standpoint, the different lemmata are not merely alternative and strictly separate logical forms of propositional thinking in themselves. Rather, they constitute successive steps of a logical itinerary, or they are together forming an inseparable but complex arrangement or not, which defines as a metalogical design of finite variability the parameters for logical thinking and the logical layout of our world. Again, logic and ontology are at this level indistinguishably intertwined. The tetralemma could then, in fact, I tentatively propose, also be stated as a trilemma, namely either or, both and, neither nor. There is no doubt that for the Aristotelian mind, the distinct lemma of either or, in an exclusive sense, assumes priority in the last instance. As outlined above, the ontological binary, based on a supposed supremacy of being, also necessarily entails the law of the excluded middle. This ontological frame logically defines itself through a systematic exclusion. Here, using Nishitani's expression, thought on the level of unhindered reason achieves its total mastery over the world, all things and all laws, resolving the contradiction of both and through a sovereign decision of either or, excluding any third middle, ultimately separating being and nothingness, discriminating the true from the false, reality from its image, law and thing, and thus assigning every being its proper place. Within the Buddhist image of thought proposed by Nishitani, this hierarchy is subverted, the order of priority between the logical lemmata rearranged, and the logical itinerary changed. It will be difficult to tell whether Nishitani through the thought of soku also ultimately aims for a priority of both and, or rather the ultimate destination of neither nor. Although both readings may remain possible, I wish to argue for the latter. This is also why I think the logic of soku is essentially linked to a subversion of Western ontology through the Mahayana Buddhist notion of emptiness. With the shift from unhindered reason to the domain of unhindered things, negativity becomes truly supreme as emptiness. The logic of soku reaches its ultimate point only when through a further negation, the walls become transparent, neither joining nor separating anything anymore, and unhindered reason shifts into what Nishitani calls awakening within the unhindered things. It is ultimately not a new form of synthesis, but a point of disjunctive releasement of thought from being, which I hold is Nishitani's true aim and real achievement. With this, I come to the second part. How do Nishitani's reflections on the logic of soku, the domains of unhindered reason and unhindered things, now play into the encounter between Buddhism and Christianity? His occasional remarks on Christianity in Ku to Soku are sparing and short, yet they hold most decisive implications, some of which I will now attempt to draw out. It is precisely in traversing the wall, the logical middle space of soku, unhindered reason and the world of one as many and many as one, that an encounter between the religions must take place. The step beyond the still limited perspective of unhindered reason is, for Nishitani, the step into the realm of religious experience. However, I propose not taking Nishitani by his own words too easily. His remarks on awakening and faith seemingly suggests a common point of origin fundamental to any religious experience. His illustrations of the act of faith beyond reason and even beyond unhindered reason, specifically, puts into parallel Zen sayings with equally seemingly absurd biblical episodes. The call of Amida, his original vow, stands in parallel with the voice calling Moses from the burning thorn bush. And in a rather offhanded remark, Nishitani states that for him, the moment of awakening taken from a distinctly Buddhist background must also be somehow included as an essential moment in Christian belief. Referencing Nagarjuna, Nishitani stresses the essential link between faith and awakening. However, against this rhetoric employed by Nishitani, I propose a different reading. For this purpose, I will first have to digress a little for what might be called a few preliminary and methodological considerations. On the one hand, using terms such as Buddhism and Christianity without any further qualification amounts to little more than overly broad generalizations with no clear insights to be gained from any comparison between them. On the other hand, I strongly disagree in principle with any purely historicist approach, which tends to differentiate its subject matter until nothing remains but a mass of incoherent details. Between these two extremes, I want to state clearly that here I'm interested in Buddhism only insofar as Nishitani uses certain Buddhist discourse as a resource for his own thought, and in Christianity insofar as it somehow figures as an object of interpretation in Nishitani's thought. Indeed, looking beyond Ku to Soku, the engagement with Christianity runs as a consistent thread through the works of Nishitani. And from his earliest years, Nishitani maintained a more or less explicitly critical stance towards the religion. More specifically, a critical stance against institutionalized Christianity and specifically what he calls at one point, the church kingdom and its colossal theological architecture. This paper is not the place to elaborate on these traces in greater detail. I will limit myself to only stating the premise for my reading of Nishitani's interpretation of Christianity succinctly. Nishitani's interpretative intervention into Christian discourse and the encounter between Buddhism and Christianity for which he makes his text a stage must be read as a strategic attempt to transform the specific theological foundations of the so-called church kingdom. It is therefore necessary, I argue, to read Nishitani's thoughts on the encounter between religions, specifically against the background of Orthodox Catholic theology, as it lays the canonical and dogmatic foundations for the institutional matrix of this church kingdom. From this standpoint, I wish to put into question whether awakening in the sense in which Nishitani introduces and uses this term here is in fact...
Please, someone have the microphone on. Well, she says, please.
Sorry.
Make off.
So, from this standpoint, I wish to put into question whether awakening in the sense in which Nishitani introduces and uses this term here is in fact an essential moment to Christian belief in and of itself. However, I also need to emphasize again that by no means do I thereby intend to suggest Nishitani simply misunderstood Christianity. To state my own approach again more clearly, I rather propose to see in Nishitani's move of inscribing a Buddhist awakening into the belief of Christianity a strategic intervention aiming at evoking a radical change in the mind of Christian believers. Its rhetoric, just as any other rhetoric, is supported by a specific desire, conscious or unconscious, and the strategy of this desire aiming to fulfill itself with meaning can be deciphered from his words without therefore having to refute or agree with Nishitani. With these preliminary remarks in mind, I will now return to Nishitani's inscription of awakening into Christian belief and the image of the wall. It is interesting to note that the image of the wall makes another appearance explicitly in regard to the Christian experience of God. In a crucial passage of Religion and Nothingness, Nishitani writes, quote, "At the bottom of all things, one encounters this nothingness of creatio ex nihilo. This nihility separates all things from God absolutely like an iron wall. To encounter this nihility must therefore mean to encounter God as an iron wall, so to speak. That is, to encounter the absolute negativity in God. God is not a creature and creatures cannot be God." End of quote. This passage curiously seems to mirror Nishitani's discussion of the experience of unhindered reason in Kuto Soku. When it reaches its limit at the stubborn reality of all things and all laws, co-originating from primeval chaos, the many appearing as a monstrous one, the world as total thing. Furthermore, in Kuto Soku, Nishitani explicitly links the notion of unhindered reason with the Christian concept of divine providence, giving all beings their proper place. Then, however, with regard to Christianity, it needs to be asked, what happens when this iron wall is traversed? In Kuto Soku, Nishitani himself suggests a possibility of traversing the wall from the side of creation through a transgression of all reason in an act of faith, reaching, so to speak, God in his Godhead. I borrow this celebrated term, as does Nishitani in other texts, from Meister Eckhart, whose name makes only a brief appearance in this text of Nishitani's. And ultimately leading to Buddhistic self-awareness and awakening. Yet, one might also say from a strictly Christian standpoint that in a certain sense, God himself traverses the iron wall by assuming human nature in Christ and entering creation. Either way, the effect of traversing the wall, which Nishitani aims at, the final consequence of awakening is crucial. I quote Nishitani, "In short, no place is sacred and nothing is there to cling to. Instead, everything, including images that are like simple absurdities, is simply an image." End of quote. What is at stake here is therefore not just the evocation of a generic religious experience. The confrontation with Christianity on this point must be seen in its radically antagonistic intensity. From an Orthodox Catholic standpoint, the iron wall can indeed never be freely traversed by creatures themselves. It is by God himself alone, through the exceptional condescension of Christ and the incarnation of the Word, that the iron wall is overcome. And insofar as the Church is founded on this exceptional and absolutely singular event, the Church kingdom is precisely the universal institution of the iron wall in its state of messianic exception. It is the mystical body of Christ claiming a holy authority and obligation as custodian and guardian to manage border control between the domains of the profane and the sacred, immanence and transcendence. As Nishitani himself touches upon explicitly in Kuto Soku, the Church, as institution of the true religion and official administration of the cross, was from its very beginning always careful to maintain its exceptional status in distinguishing itself from and prohibiting myth and magic, systematically eradicating all absurdities and destroying all false pagan gods, defending the reality of the one true God and the only exceptional absurdity to cling to forever, the fact of incarnation, Christ crucified and resurrected. Furthermore, the Church, as a hermeneutic bureaucracy, has its own peculiar way of arranging the lemmata which define the limits of logic. The institutional reality of the Church and its theological hermeneutics is systematically determined by a priority of the lemma both and not neither nor. In the words of Carl Schmitt, the Church is in every respect a complexio oppositorum. In the words of Nishitani, the Church could be called an institution of unhindered reason. The main purpose of the Church institution, its sacramental function, is to lead all souls to salvation through incorporation into the mystical body of Christ and their participation in the Eucharistic mystery of Christ crucified. The Catholic enframing, Pater Heidegger, of the world, universal management of the messianic state of exception and its salvific love economy ultimately serve only this function, to crucify creation, to universalize the state of messianic exception and transpose all things into the total limit situation of the sacrificial or kenotic act of the cross, the machine to return to heaven, borrowing an expression from first century church father Ignatius of Antioch. To use Nishitani's expression again, the cross is precisely the iron wall, initially separating creature and creator, now transformed in a state of exception. The iron wall is transformed through grace into the universal machine of salvation, the cross. The nihility of creation is perfected through the nihility of redemption. Within the iron walls of Catholic enframing, every creature must be restored in the image of Christ, become a slave of love, labor and suffer for the love and greater glory of God, with the final goal of being eternally united with the loving Creator in a heavenly both and. Seen from the standpoint of Orthodox Catholic Christianity, the world is to be restored in the image of Christ, not through the individual power of a poetically free imagination. What the shift towards self-awareness and awakening which Nishitani evokes effectively amounts to is therefore nothing less than a radical abolition of the Church's claim to institutional exceptionality. Thus, a fundamental critique of the authority of the Church kingdom, as divine institution. When seen from this perspective, the essential antagonism between Christianity and Buddhism cannot be overstated. Now, when a compassionate Buddha, or rather one who is determined to meet the enlightened, decides to traverse the iron wall, the repercussions for God and the Church must naturally be disastrous. When the Catholic enframing of the world and its logic of both and as complexio oppositorum is dislocated and dissolved through the tetralemmatic unfolding of the logic of soku, reaching the supreme neither nor of the world opening in emptiness, then the moment of awakening will herald the collapse of all walls, the abolition of the messianic state of exception and its universal management, the end of Holy Mass and Eucharistic ceremony, the end of sacramental liturgy and universal love economy, the deactivation of the heavenly machine and the destruction of the cross, the end of all love, labor, ad majorem Dei gloriam, the entrance into the world of unhindered things. To quote Nishitani again, in short, no place is sacred and nothing is there to cling to. Instead, everything, including images that are like simple absurdities, is simply an image. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have 30 minutes, more or less. Jim, please.
A little bit of history, a background that might be useful for your discussion of Nishitani and Christianity. In the same year that Nishitani published Kuto Soku, the Tozai Koryu Gakkai began. This was a group of Christians and Buddhists that gathered annually for intense discussions, short presentations and intense discussions for 3 days. Nishitani was a member of that group. And in 1984, he presented an overview of his idea of relationships between Buddhism and Christianity based on the idea of the front, the walls. Okay. So Nishitani was there, and also there present at the time was Yagi Seiichi. A few years later, Yagi Seiichi wrote a book called Die Frontstruktur, which was precisely to take the opposite position from the one you did from the same essay. So it might be of Nishitani, so it might be good to have a look at. The other thing is Yagi Seiichi was Mukyokai. He was anti-institutional church. And I would say that all of the members who were there at that, and we met for 40 years, so it's still going on, the association, that all the members who met had none of this attachment to the dogmatic church you talk about. But on the other hand, we all understood that the Christian tradition has an underside, an alchemical, a hermetic, a mystical, a Gnostic tradition in which Buddhist elements are present everywhere. And without that tradition, we wouldn't have Christianity. So Nishitani was against institutional religion. He was against dogmatism. And in his essays on lectures on Buddhism, he's very strongly against the same thing in Buddhism. But that's not Christianity. That's institutional, dogmatic Christianity. So I think it might be good to have a look at Yagi Seiichi's work as a kind of counterbalance to what you're doing, at least as an alternative way of reading Nishitani. So his book was published in 1988, I think. And later, part of that book, one of the essays was published in a book that Leonard Swidler edited on Christian Buddhist dialogue, but I don't remember the title of that book. Yeah. Anyway, just a historical comment, yeah. So you're saying that Nishitani was against institutional?
He was against institutional religions in all forms, not against the institutional, but against the identification of the tradition with the institution. The institutions he thought were necessary evils, necessary to keep traditions and religions and rituals alive. But he was against the identification very clearly, as were all the people that gathered to use his thought and the thought of the Kyoto school, which is what the Tozai Koryu Gakkai has done, as a basis for Christians and Buddhists dialoguing and looking for common territory. So, but that's just a separate history that there's no way that you would probably have known about. But it might be interesting to have a look at it. The Nishitani's essays were published in Daijo Zen, which is a journal that Akizuki Ryomin published for many years. Akizuki was one of the founding members, together with Takizawa. The very first lecture, by the way, was by Takizawa, who also, by the way, takes the opposite position from you in these matters. So Takizawa is really important. And he's the one person that Nishida said understood my Basho no Ronri. So, Takizawa is worth having a look at too. And Hisamatsu, and then Hisamatsu's disciples, they were all part of this group that we met every year and continue to meet now. So anyway, yeah.
Can I drop in? Hello.
Yes,
Jim. Yeah, can I say something?
Yes.
Well, Jim, it's very interesting what you said there. Of course, you know that I'm not in favor of Gnosticism as the way forward. In fact, I have offered to give a talk for Catherine Corney on a very impossible subject, the Nicene Creed in religious perspective. The Nicene Creed celebrating its 1700th centenary next year, 325. And I don't know what I'm going to say because the subject looks completely impossible. The Nicene Creed with Constantine, with the bishops, with the council, the whole foundation of the dogmatic tradition on one hand, and Buddhism on the other, basically Buddhism, perhaps Judaism too. It's an impossible subject, and that's why I'm trying to tackle it. But I think the Catholic Church, in the broadest sense, right? But if you look closely at the texture, dogmatic topic that there is, they can be read in such a way as to bring out a kind of contextual or skillful means techie, or pastoral or pragmatist dimension. I mean, even look at the Nicene Creed itself. It's a terrifically. I'm working out my lecture now from scratch, but it's a terrifically adroit and strategic thing. These bishops, they wanted to affirm the divinity of Christ, right? How do you do that? Well, they took the Johannine prologue. That's where the main source of all the ideas in the creed comes from that. And they exegeted it with the aid of the notion of substance, which is a metaphysical notion. But did that mean that they were deliberately trying to make the creed more straight-laced, more dogmatic, more metaphysical? Or did it mean that it was kind of a desperate remedy? They just grabbed this skillful means. Let's say that the Son is from the essence of the Father, ectes ousios to patros. That's to say, from the reality of the Father. This is the first creed, now, Creed 25, not the later one that we recite in church. There was a point, there was a purpose in what they were saying, right? And the purpose was to defend their vision of Christ as really on the same plane as the Father, as not to be treated as a demigod or some kind of secondary thing. The point is, though, that the whole thing is a terrifically mobile situation, because for 60 years after that, there was constant controversy about what this creed actually meant, and should we replace it, should we dump it? And in the end, they kept it in 381, which is a long time later. So all I'm saying is that the dogmatic tradition of the church, it's not really, I mean, you can say it's imprisoning faith and it led to the Inquisition and this, that, and the other, but you can also read it in a more pragmatic way, I think. And maybe Buddhism and its notion of the skillful means of conventional truth would help us to find such a way of reading the dogmatic tradition. And I mean, Harnack is very important. Dogma in its origin and development is a product of the Greek mind which is metaphysics, on the soil of the gospel. There's a tension there between metaphysics and the soil of the gospel. And deepening that tension, exploring that tension, again with the aid of Heidegger, who had read Harnack in depth, is one of the ways forward, I would say.
Well, if there are not more questions. Are there more questions? Otherwise, I would maybe shortly reply to the remarks of Mr. Heisig, because I'm not sure in what sense they take an opposite reading of Nishitani's when they emphasize or go in that direction that you mentioned, because as I understood this whole critique of institutionalized Christianity or the church Christianity, that was in a sense the point I was trying to make, in the sense that I limit myself in pointing out that Nishitani's engagement with Christianity has this polemical side to it, that it is an explicit attempt, more or less explicit attempt, to separate a version of Christianity, or to separate Christianity from this institutionalized Christianity, from the church. But at the same time, as Professor Leary pointed out, I I disagree with the notion that dogmatic theology or the church theology is just a political deformation of a spiritual or intellectual faith or a philosophy. Because when one looks at the history precisely of the development of these of the creed or the Trinitarian theology, all the church fathers constantly and all the doctors of the church through the centuries, they were constantly in intellectual debate and struggle with the Platonic academies, with the Neoplatonists, with the Gnostics, with all the heretics, with the influence from Asia, and they tried to defend a certain thought content. For example, Trinitarian theology against Platonic ideas of the one, or precisely these kind of alchemical, magical, mystical strains that come from ancient mystery religions. But why did they defend themselves against that? Was it just because it served the legitimization of the power structure as this kind of parasitical deformation of some pure spiritual content of thought? I don't think so. I think that there is indeed a structural difference, a different content of thought, without taking part in analyzing, without taking sides in analyzing these differences. But I do think that there is an essential difference. And maybe in that regard, I do differ from the reading that these authors mentioned propose of Nishitani, in that I see that Nishitani's version of Christianity is critical and of the church Christianity, but at the same time, it is a criticism that doesn't by default propose in a certain sense, unspoiled or pure version of Christianity. I leave it open and propose precisely the structural difference between what I see as the institutional logic of the church against what he proposes as this Buddhistic, Mahayanistically interpreted version of Christianity. Again, without therefore taking sides, but just in pointing out and showing that there are these strategies that work. There is this polemical underside. And by that also that on the other side of that front, there is a very concrete logic at play that I think might be, this is what I tried to suggest also, might be mapped onto what Nishitani develops as the logic of unhindered reason. So yes, I'm not sure in what sense you say it's the opposite side.
There's no doubt that there's a structural difference between Nishitani's version of Mahayana logic and dogmatic official Christianity. But that's not the part of Christianity that most of the people in the dialogue were interested in. They were interested in the other kinds of traditions, the apophatic traditions, the mystical traditions. He also mentioned Gnosticism, that's much less interesting. But there are agraphic, that is to say, apocryphal texts. For example, I myself wrote a book on the Gospel of Thomas, which is the only Christian gospel which is absolutely structurally different from the Nicene Creed that Joseph was talking about, and is a gospel of enlightenment, period. I mean, Buddhist. And it's older, by the way, than Q, the source of the New Testament. So there are traditions that Buddhism meshes with immediately. I don't remember in all the years of the Tozai that we ever had a debate about creedal Christianity as opposed to Buddhist ideas of nothingness or karma or whatever it happens to be. I don't recall, because that's it doesn't go anywhere. I would say that most of the dialogues that took place with the official dogmatic Christianity, Christian churches and Buddhism have been tea parties, polite tea parties where they make a generic prayer at the end. But anything substantial, we had to deal with the underbelly of Christianity, which is interesting. I mean, we have Christianity has the surface and it has this underside, which is necessary to it, this current flowing under the surface, without which we couldn't survive. The heresies, the poetries, the mysticisms. In Buddhism, everything is pretty much on the surface. I mean, they have this idea of conventional truth. Conventional truth is not a part of dogmatic Christianity. Structurally, it doesn't fit. I mean, even that, you're absolutely right. It doesn't work. And Joseph is one who has struggled to show that it can work. We agree and disagree on that at some points, but he struggled to say that it isn't as radical as you and I might think of, and I think it is.
I think with the synthesis, something works that something similar as well, right? With she's the business there, right? No, just a comment, but I remember hearing something in that vein from him as well. So
Ueda was also a big part of these discussions until his death. Well, 2 years before his death, was also part of those discussions. And as you know, his work on mysticism, on Eckhart, has been really crucial.
so I remember like hearing something from him, like exactly what you're saying. So it's where it comes from. So.
I just want to follow up because I had one question in your presentation of Nishitani. He explicitly in this text speaks about, if you want to understand the different roles of faith, you need to go back to magic. But I didn't hear you say magic once. And in other places, he draws a reasonably clear line between Buddhism and Christianity on the grounds of myth, which does figure again in the magical mythical. And when you say, well, there's this underbelly, there's these two, and depending on where your focal length is or how your tradition, you'll know how much of them under the belly there is, and how it constantly resurges, right? But then you said, it doesn't have this idea of conventional truth, which now brings me back to my question about, well, what about this?
Official Christianity, dogmatic, doesn't have it. The other tradition, of course, that's.
But the fact that this is sort of the whole thing for Buddha, the Buddhist perspective, or Nishitani's version of the Buddhism, it's just the conventional. It's just the images are images. Don't right. And so I'm wondering if you can respond to this. What is then the magical mythical that
in Christianity?
Well,
correspond to that?
Yeah.
Look at Eckhart. Just read Eckhart on images. His whole idea, my whole goal, he says, is to see God naked, to creep into his dressing room and catch him when he's changing images. Eckhart is full of,
but he would be
demythifying
the underbelly.
Yes, exactly. Yes, not on the surface. No,
the fact that it's part of the fact that there is an underbelly.
Yeah.
Is what I'm curious about. Is that the fact that it has to have an underbelly?
Yeah, it is curious. Yeah, because of dogmatic Christianity made it necessary. I mean, creeds and heresies made it necessary.
Well, I'm sorry. I did mention magic and myth. Explicitly. In the sense that a crucial difference I see, although it pertains at least in this comment on Nishitani's text, to the dogmatic, institutionalized version of Christianity, precisely in the difference that, if one wants to call it that, the church only allows for one kind of magic, namely the exceptional magic that founds it, that is the founding reference. And everything else is destroyed as mere absurdity, as irrational, as a pagan idolatry. And Nishitani explicitly mentions that in the text, that the institutionalized version of Christianity has been a constant struggle against everything that was perceived as a threat to its own exceptionality. And I would argue in the same way that that Professor Ueda also did in his study in his magisterial work on Meister Eckhart in the end, where he compares Zen Buddhism and Eckhartian spirituality, where he in the end draws the conclusion they are not the same. There is a decisive difference because in the end, Eckhart still clings to God. And it's an imagery of love. It's the fulfillment of the Song of Songs. It's the high Christian spirituality of love. And Zen Buddhism isn't about love. It is not about love because it is not about this exceptionality of the object or involved in this experience. And even in Eckhart, there is still the exceptionality because God is not a creature of this world. The flower or whatever you might see, like the whale being drawn on the offing at the shore, the empty house in autumn, the autumn leaves. They are everyday phenomena. They are part of this world. God, as the supreme lover, isn't. There is an exception. And this is what I try to point out again and again. There's a specific structural logic to the exceptionality. And this is what founds the church and what is crucial also, I think, for the development of, for example, the creedal spirituality, even pertaining to the undercurrent. And I think not just that, but also this, of course, and I kind of snuck that in my presentation with this reference to Heidegger, when I speak of the Catholic enframing of the world, which is the English translation of Heidegger's term for technology, for das Gestell, the essence of technology. Because I think one can make that point even with Nishitani, because I do think he had this conscience. The so-called secular age and modernity has its roots precisely in this Western institutionalized version of Christianity, in the imperial Roman form of institutionalized Christianity. Precisely, and this goes back to your remark, because it was a history of destroying magic, destroying irrationality, eradicating all absurdities, eradicating all myth. And also, as Nietzsche already pointed out in the 19th century, famously so, this in a certain sense, by extrapolation, led in Christianity itself becoming implausible or be considered just an absurdity, and therefore facilitating this nihilistic collapse that we are, one might argue, still living through. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that I think what is a kind of undercurrent of this struggle between Buddhism and Christianity, as I try to portray it, is in fact behind this institutionalized version of Christianity, the same struggle that Nishitani is constantly engaging in, namely the struggle with modernity. Modernity as the age of nihilism and the age of secularity, which is also the age where precisely this Buddhist form of magic is lost. And I would go so far to argue that it is lost because of the institutional and framing logic coming from the Catholic Church.
I think the institutional protectors of the Catholic Church would agree with you.
I think so too.
What you're saying is precisely what the most conservative bishops are saying, which is syncretism is finished. Okay, we put up with it for the first century or first 150 years, but no more synchronism, no more paganism. And Buddhism is structurally different from Christianity. They don't believe in God, for heaven's sakes, or an eternal soul or heaven and hell. They don't have these literal beliefs that we do. So why should we dialogue with them? It's pointless. But I would say the point that that Nishitani made in entering into dialogue with Christianity, remember he referred to himself as a gewordene Buddhist and a werdene Christ. Actually, he stole the phrase from Tanabe, but it's I think his reason for doing it was precisely that, well, we are in a syncretism. Syncretism's always going on. Christianity is not like the official churches suppose it is. Just go look at it. Look at it in Asia. Look at it in Africa. Look at it in South America. Syncretism's going on. So why can't it happen among intellectuals who work with texts? Is syncretism bad? Is it a heresy in the traditional sense of an optional way of looking, or is it heresy in the sense of an exclusive, an exceptionalism that makes it impossible to dialogue? So the position you take is the position that there are still elements in the Protestant and Catholic churches that take that very position, say, no, it's too different. But I would say that the Tozai Koryu Gakkai and Nishitani and Ueda and Yagi and Akizuki and this whole group, they took the exact opposite position.
But that's why you have the church. Sorry, I would have more questions, but that's why you have the church as an institution. And like you're saying, you have the church that is being practiced like every day in Africa, South America, in Asia, in all these places, right? You see the syncretism, right? Like going on all the time. And also, I think that's why both Nishitani and Ueda as well say that when they say that Buddhism has no dogmas, what they are saying is not that. They're saying that, like you're saying, like in these first centuries of the Catholic Church, these dogmas were decided or made like concrete or something like that. But you still have this mysticism and magic and stuff like flowing under it. While in Buddhism, they are flourishing, right? They're still like on the surface, like you're saying. So that's something as well, because I see many people like don't understanding these.
I think also there's a kind of affinity for the person of Jesus, the same way that many Christians feel a natural affinity for the talks of the Buddha, or the questions of King Melinda, the Gospels. There's a natural affinity there, and let me just state something for myself. In the church, when we pronounce the creed, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, substantial, co-substantial with the Son, before all things were made and for all for. And then in the resurrection and then life of the world to come. We believe that whole thing. That's not my creed at all.
Yeah.
First of all, Jesus would not have understood hardly a line of that. He didn't have the education, and he didn't have the theology that came after him. So it's unintelligible to Jesus. That's the creed on which I base my faith. Secondly, there's not one line left of the teachings of Jesus, which is why I'm a Christian. I'm not a Christian because of the Holy Roman Catholic Church and its empire and its ideas. I mean, that's very impressive, and there's a rich intellectual tradition, and but heavens to Betsy, that's no reason. So I think this is the mentality of many people who enter into dialogue and open to new forms of communication and enhancement, mutual enhancement, without changing our structural differences. You are absolutely right, structural differences. And I would mention that, what's his name, the famous Chomsky, once came up with what he thought were 5 or 6 markers, I think he called them, for Christianity. You could look that up somewhere, saying without these things, there would not be Christianity, like the divinity of Christ and the soul and the afterlife and so forth. That was precisely the most conservative position being taken at that time. If you don't believe that stuff, we can't talk to you. We have nothing to learn from you. If you deny any of these things, we're not prepared to part with them. So there's 2 ways to enter into dialogue. One is you enter as a representative of your tradition, and you have to present it to other people and answer their questions about it, and clarify what the tradition says, officially and unofficially. The other way to enter into dialogue is one who has been trained in that tradition, one has been raised in that tradition, and then you just talk about a problem. And I've never felt myself responsible or even capable of representing the entirety of the Christian tradition, or even my own Catholic tradition, or even my own European Catholic tradition. That's way too much. But I was one raised in that tradition and raised in other traditions as well. And that's how you enter in and talk. It isn't Buddhism says this, yes, but Christianity says this. Well, which one could be right? No, it's like we have a problem here. There's poverty. What do we do about it? Well, from our scriptures, we say this, and then, dialogue goes on. So I think the dialogue between the Buddhist institution and Christian institution is pretty much disaster. And I would mention one thing that came out of this Tozai Koryu Gakkai that you might find interesting. And that is Jan van Bracht brought heads of the main monasteries of Rinzai and Soto Zen to Europe to stay in the monasteries of Europe. And they sent their abbots and abbesses over here to Japan. And after that, there was a Koryu that began. And there was one young man who went and spent a year or 2 in Sancto Tilian, a Soto Zen, actually a very famous now, a Soto Zen monk, who went and spent 2 years there. And Notgar Wolf was the head of the Benedictines at the time. And after he left, Notgar was in Kyoto, and we went to a Chinese restaurant. And I said, by the way, how did so-and-so do? He said, that young monk, that young Buddhist monk, he said, he asked me the most difficult question I have ever been asked as an abbot. He said, he came to me a few weeks before he was going home, and he was there with his bald head and everything, you know. And he said, "Have I been a good monk?" And he said, I told him, "You've been a better monk than most of my monks." No, I don't mean do I keep the rule. Do I understand it? He says, yes. You've read it through, you understand it, you interpret it. When you speak of it, you are more intelligent than my monks. I wish they would be like you. He said, well, then I have one question to ask. Before I go, would it be okay if you baptized me so I could go to communion once? Just once. And he thought to himself, this man deserves baptism, but he's not going to stop being a Buddhist. There's a structural difference, right? Exactly what you talked about. How can I baptize? So he said, yeah, for a Buddhist, it wouldn't have been a problem. No? Even Akizuki became a Christian in college for a while. You know? So he said, everything in my heart told me yes. I baptize you, you go to communion. But everything in my tradition said no. And he said, in the end, I followed my tradition. But he said, you know, Jim, to this day, I don't know how to confess my sin. So that's precisely the tension that arises from these structural differences you talk about. And for me, that statement was a very spiritual statement and a great spiritual step for the Christian tradition to be able to get to the point where that becomes a problem and the man makes that kind of confession. I think that's wonderful. We should continue like that.
So if I just quickly before we maybe take the last question, this is why I put the emphasis precisely on the Eucharistic mystery as in contradistinction to what Nishitani tries to inscribe into the act of faith as awakening. Because there, again, might also pertain to the question earlier by Mr. Lofts, is that I see the crucial difference in that precisely in that the Eucharist as a liturgical practice, a liturgical operation that founds the institution of the church, and that is as a reference point of founding supreme importance to the whole institutional structure and all the theology that surrounds it. I see precisely this logic of exception at play, and crucially so as the most intimate link that also pertains, I think, to the exceptionalism still found in the undercurrents of Christianity, insofar as precisely the intimacy with God in the Godhead that one can find in Eckhatian spirituality is a kind of Eucharistic scene. It is the intimacy of love and the unification in a loving act. And not awakening I think not awakening in the sense that the bottom of loneliness falls off, as Nishitani describes it, which is also, I would argue, not in the same sense an exceptional event, a singular exception, as this Eucharistic, the participation in the Eucharistic mystery is, or the Eucharist itself as a mystery is. Because essentially, I think by its own structure, the Eucharistic mystery, insofar it is a prolongation of the singular event, of a singular fact of crucifixion, of messianic incarnation, is a once and for all singularity in history that can have no other. It is just by its own logic in the Catholic institution, it is not repeated. It is enacted. It is enacted in the sense that it is still the same moment forever that is happening in the Eucharist.
That's the structure, mythical structure.
That's the structure of it, but that's the point I'm making. This is a decisively different structure with a specific outline that one can analyze to what Nishitani is proposing as an overcoming or as an alternative to that structure. And I would argue that when awakening happens in the sense that Nishitani proposes here, the Eucharist, and this is how I ended the Eucharist is done.
Right.
There is no more liturgical operation.
Structure.
Yes, because it is the exit from that structure. We can exit that enframing. We are outside that enframing.
Yeah, I don't know if it's exiting, but
And you might want to look at the work of Raimundo Panikar, because he spent his whole life trying to show how the exceptionalism is point of contact. There are possibilities of other Christs and other Eucharists and so forth. And there's a possibility of Christian enlightenment. That's his book on feedback.
But yeah, that's another story.
Notice that the exceptionalism though goes back to the actual founding event, as you said yourself. Le fait chrétien, as the French call it, the Christian fact. If you read the early apologists like Irenaeus and Origen and Tertullian, they all come back to that there is a specific historical reality, that God first established Judaism, then Christianity. Christianism was the word used by Origen. And there's a series of things, the death and resurrection of Christ, the church community, the apostles, the martyrs, and altogether they form a very concrete and irreducible event. That's before dogma, really. And then Jim talks a lot about this magical underbelly, but the church does have a magical underbelly, which is called Scripture. And I would say Scripture released from the enframing metaphysical interpretation of it, which has dominated too much. Luther, if you like, released St. Paul from metaphysical captivity. He got the Pauline event powerfully on his radar. And I would say the Johannine event, Johannine mysticism, Johannine contemplation, still needs to be released from the doctrinal grip that we have on it.
Yes. Sorry, finally, I would like to hear the question or comment of Takeshita Ruggeri-Anna. Thank you for waiting so long.
I'm sorry, I'm not good to find the time to enter in the discussion. I'm sorry. One of the last, I am Anna Ruggeri Takeshita, and one of the last sentence was about Zen and Buddhism. I heard that in Zen Buddhism there is no love, and this is not, it's completely wrong, because I'm doing research on Zen Buddhism for 30 years until now, especially on a Zen master called Hakuin Zenji. And in his work, he wrote everywhere that Zen is love. Of course, he doesn't use the word love. He used the word, many words, like Jihi is the most famous word. Anyway, the practice, the Zen practice, the Zazen or Koan or other kind of practice are linked to the salvation of the sentient beings. And so when you practice, it means that it's linked after the first Satori is linked to the salvation of the sentient being. This is the biggest love. Form of love. And anyway, I wanted to say something in the general discussion, but I don't understand if now it's the general discussion. Anyway, there is no more time, so I want to say before we talked about the technique for Nishitani, and as Washi-sensei said before, Nishitani wrote about technique in many works, and there is especially one, there is a Zen no Tachiba, the standpoint of Zen. There is a chapter on Zen and science, Zen Tokagaku, and in this chapter there is a discussion on the concept of science and technique. And I remember because I did a presentation on this chapter during the Nishitani Kenkyukai in Kyoto, a seminary on Nishitani that we have three times in a year. Anyway, many years ago. And I remember that for Nishitani, there was a kind of fear when he spoke about science. And I think that time I thought that was linked to the experience of the atomic bomb. So through the science and the technique, there was this, I felt this kind of fear. And it was interesting because Emma Lavinia Bon said that she spoke about AI artificial intelligence, but of course, Nishitani didn't know about this. But there is, anyway, in another sense, this kind of fear against science and technique. Another thing was that Emma said about Nishitani that we have to go behind the intelligence. In this sentence, I think there is a big influence of Zen, because it's so famous that the experience of enlightenment and the Zen experience can happen behind the intelligence, behind the word, and so on. So this Zen influence, I think, is very strong in Nishitani. Thank you.
Tobias, the last I have to regarding the question of love in Zen. I mean, of course, I might have to add the qualification that at least there is not love in the Christian sense. But I also found it curious that you, as an example, gave Jihi. And Jihi, in my own opinion and reading, I would still hold, is not love, because it is compassion, and compassion isn't love. I would even argue, and I think that this connects on a deeper level, maybe one could say ontological level, with what I called in my paper a disjunctive releasement of thought from being that is reached in the domain of unhindered things, and which I would say Nishitani argues for. This compassion is even linked to this releasement of thought from being as a releasement from being, an openness to emptiness, and is, I would argue, therefore, a kind of compassion precisely with and against love. Love as a love or a zeal for being, a clinging to being.
Agape. Compassion and agape.
But I would still argue that the kind of agape that is a benevolent care and beneficent care for being is something essentially different than the Buddhistic compassion for those who cling to being, and that have to be I think you've got arrows. You got a little bit of arrows in your agape.
Nishitani said the prime example of Christian love was kenosis.
Well, but I mean, what is eros in agape if not Meister Eckhart seeing God undress in a chamber?
Oh no!
There's a that metaphor too.
You talk to Jim about that, and that's right. But also, I think that the Eckhart quote should not be read as an object of eros.
Of course.
What?
I think
sorry, yes.
It's just a problem of word, but we have to see what is this love, what is this compassion in the reality in our life, in the world. And we are human being, the same human being, and we do something. There are something similar, I think. So I think you are too linked to the word, and it's not possible to find the exact word in another language. So if you say Jihi is compassion, but is not love, I think we have to go to see a little bit in deeper in when we compare two different notion and words from other culture, as Jim said, Professor Isaac said a few minutes ago, and that's it. I have an experience that the master said to me, you don't have to use the word love, and you have to use the word Jihi. But at that time, I was not so angry with my master. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I'm sorry, but I think it's time to close the first day of our workshop. Tomorrow we can continue in the morning sessions. The speaker will be Professor Abe, I guess. And then we continue till late in the evening. So, and last thing, in case someone of you wants to receive the back number of Daijo Zen or Tozai Shukyo, we have a lot of copies in our repository, and we can send to you all the back numbers that you want, but you have to pay for the cost. So if you are interested to back number of these journals or books published by the institute here in Nansa, please contact me and we can send you everything. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.